Boy finds medal in attic, realizes his grandfather was a legendary war hero. The lazy summer breeze drifted through the open windows of the old farmhouse, carrying with it the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and blooming wildflowers. Jake, a lanky 12-year-old with an unruly mop of chestnut hair, sprawled on the living room couch, his eyes fixed on the slowly rotating ceiling fan. The monotonous whir of the blades matched the dull buzz of boredom in his mind. It was the third week of his summer vacation, and Jake had exhausted every possible form of entertainment in his grandparents' quiet, rural town. He'd explored the creek behind the house, climbed every climbable tree in the orchard, and even helped his grandfather, Tom, tend to the vegetable garden. But now, as the relentless summer heat pressed down on the sleepy town, Jake found himself restless and yearning for adventure. His grandmother, Margaret, bustled about the kitchen, the gentle clink of dishes and the aroma of freshly baked cookies filling the air. She hummed softly to herself, a habit Jake had always found comforting. But today, even the promise of warm, gooey chocolate chip cookies couldn't lift his spirits. Jake's gaze wandered around the room, taking in the familiar sights: the worn, comfortable furniture, the faded family photos on the walls, and the ancient grandfather clock ticking away in the corner. His eyes eventually settled on the narrow door at the far end of the hallway, the door that led to the attic. A spark of curiosity ignited in Jake's mind. The attic had always been off-limits, with his grandmother insisting it was too cluttered and dusty for exploration. But now, with the allure of the unknown calling to him, Jake couldn't resist the temptation. Glancing towards the kitchen to make sure his grandmother was still occupied, Jake quietly slipped off the couch and padded down the hallway. He reached for the doorknob, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The metal was cool against his palm as he turned it slowly, wincing at the faint creak that echoed through the silent house. The door swung open, revealing a set of narrow, wooden stairs disappearing into darkness. Jake hesitated for a moment, straining his ears for any sign that his grandmother had heard him. Satisfied that he remained undetected, he took a deep breath and began his ascent. Each step groaned under his weight, and Jake found himself holding his breath, convinced that at any moment he would hear his grandmother's voice calling him back. But no such interruption came, and soon he found himself standing at the top of the stairs, enveloped in the musty darkness of the attic. Sunlight filtered through a small, round window at the far end of the space, casting long shadows across the room. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, swirling with each of Jake's cautious movements. The air was thick and warm, carrying the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Jake began to make out the shapes of the attic's contents. Old furniture draped in white sheets loomed like silent sentinels, while cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly created a maze-like path through the space. Trunks of various sizes were scattered about, their brass latches tarnished with age. Jake's curiosity grew with each step he took deeper into the attic. He ran his fingers along the spines of old books piled on a rickety shelf, marveling at the titles from another era. A collection of his grandmother's old dresses hung from a clothing rack, the once vibrant fabrics now faded and delicate. As he navigated through the cluttered space, Jake's foot caught on something protruding from beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. He stumbled, catching himself on a nearby trunk. Curious, he knelt down and began to carefully move the blankets aside. There, half buried under decades of accumulated possessions, was a small, intricately carved wooden chest. Its dark wood gleamed dully in the faint light, and Jake could make out intricate patterns etched into its surface. His heart raced as he gently pulled the chest free from its hiding place. The chest was heavier than he expected, and Jake could hear something shifting inside as he moved it. He searched for a latch or lock, his fingers tracing the edges of the lid. Finally, he found a small, ornate clasp at the front of the chest. With trembling hands, he released the clasp and slowly lifted the lid. The hinges creaked softly as the chest opened, releasing a waft of air that smelled of old paper and metal. Jake's eyes widened as he took in the contents of the chest. Nestled within were an assortment of medals and ribbons, their colors still vibrant despite the passage of time. Faded photographs were scattered among the awards, showing young men in military uniforms with serious expressions. But it was the object at the center of the collection that truly caught Jake's attention. Resting on a bed of faded blue velvet was a large, gleaming medal. Even in the dim light of the attic, its gold surface seemed to glow. Jake carefully lifted the medal, his breath catching as he realized what he was holding. It was a Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded for acts of valor. Jake had learned about it in school, had seen pictures in his history books, but he never imagined he'd be holding one in his own hands, and certainly not one that belonged to his family. Questions raced through Jake's mind as he stared at the medal. Whose was it? Why had he never known about it? And why was it hidden away in this dusty attic instead of proudly displayed? As Jake's eyes darted between the medal and the photographs, a realization slowly dawned on him. The young man featured in many of the photos, standing tall in his military uniform, bore a striking resemblance to his grandfather, Tom. But this couldn't be the same man as the gentle, quiet grandfather Jake knew, could it? Jake's mind reeled with the implications of his discovery. His grandfather, the man who spent his days tending to his garden and teaching Jake how to fish, had a past that was suddenly both mysterious and heroic. The quiet, unassuming man who always had a kind word and a patient smile was, apparently, a war hero. As Jake sat there in the warm, dusty attic, surrounded by the echoes of a history he never knew existed, he felt as though he was seeing his grandfather and his entire family in a completely new light. The Medal of Honor gleamed in his hands, a tangible link to a past filled with bravery, sacrifice, and untold stories. With careful reverence, Jake placed the medal back in the chest and closed the lid. He knew he couldn't leave this discovery unaddressed. The weight of the secret he'd uncovered pressed upon him, filling him with a mixture of pride, curiosity, and a touch of apprehension. As he made his way back down the creaky attic stairs, the chest clutched tightly in his arms, Jake's mind raced with questions. How would he approach his grandfather about this? Would Tom be upset that Jake had discovered his hidden past? Or would this be the key to unlocking a treasure trove of stories and experiences Jake had never known about? With each step, Jake's determination grew. He would find a way to uncover the truth behind the medals, to understand the man his grandfather had been before becoming the gentle gardener he knew. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the smell of his grandmother's cookies wafting through the air, Jake knew that his summer had suddenly become far more interesting than he could have ever imagined. The wooden chest felt impossibly heavy in Jake's arms as he carefully made his way down the hall to the guest room where he was staying. His mind raced with the magnitude of his discovery, each step echoing with the weight of untold history. As he gently placed the chest on his bed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding more than just medals and photographs. He was cradling the secrets of a life he thought he knew. The late afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the patchwork quilt his grandmother had made. Jake sat cross-legged on the bed, his fingers tracing the carved patterns on the chest's lid. With a deep breath, he opened it once more, the familiar scent of aged paper and metal filling the air. This time, Jake took his time examining each item in the chest. He carefully lifted out the photographs, studying the faces of young men frozen in time. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions a mix of pride and apprehension. In some photos, Jake's grandfather, or rather, the young man who would become his grandfather, stood tall among his comrades. There was a hardness in his eyes that Jake had never seen before, a determination that seemed at odds with the gentle gardener he knew. One photo, in particular, caught Jake's attention. It showed his grandfather standing alone, his uniform adorned with ribbons and medals. The background was blurry, but Jake could make out the vague shapes of tents and military vehicles. What struck him most was the expression on his grandfather's face, a complex mixture of weariness, resolve, and something else Jake couldn't quite identify. Sorrow, perhaps, or regret. As Jake set the photos aside, his gaze fell once more on the Medal of Honor. He lifted it carefully, feeling its weight in his palm. The golden surface caught the sunlight, sending shimmering reflections dancing across the walls. Jake tried to imagine the moment his grandfather had received this medal. Had there been a ceremony? Were there speeches about bravery and sacrifice? And why, after all that, had his grandfather chosen to hide it away in a dusty attic? The more Jake pondered, the more questions arose. He thought back to all the times he'd spent with his grandfather, fishing by the creek, working in the garden, or simply sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Never once had Tom mentioned his military service or the accolades he'd received. Jake had always assumed his grandfather had led a quiet, unremarkable life. Now, he realized how wrong he'd been. Jake's mind wandered to the stories he'd read in history books about war heroes. He'd always imagined them as larger-than-life figures, boldly charging into battle without fear. But as he looked at the photos of his grandfather, young, serious, and undeniably human, Jake began to understand that heroism wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it was about ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself lost in thought, trying to reconcile the grandfather he knew with the young soldier in the photographs. He imagined what it must have been like for Tom, leaving behind everything familiar to fight in a war on distant shores. What had he seen? What experiences had shaped him into the man Jake knew today? The sound of his grandmother calling him for dinner startled Jake out of his reverie. He quickly but carefully packed everything back into the chest, hiding it under his bed. As he made his way to the dining room, Jake's mind was still swirling with questions and theories. The familiar scents of his grandmother's cooking filled the air: pot roast, mashed potatoes, and fresh-baked rolls. Jake's parents, who had arrived earlier that day for the weekend, were already seated at the table. His father was engrossed in conversation with Tom about the latest developments in the garden, while his mother helped Margaret bring the last of the dishes to the table. As Jake took his seat, he couldn't help but study his grandfather more closely. Tom sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands folded neatly in front of him. His silver hair caught the warm light of the dining room, and the creases around his eyes deepened as he smiled at something Jake's father said. How could this gentle, unassuming man be the same person who had earned the nation's highest military honor? Throughout dinner, Jake found it hard to concentrate on the conversations around him. He pushed his food around his plate, his appetite diminished by the weight of the secret he carried. Every now and then, he would glance at his grandfather, searching for any hint of the young soldier he'd seen in the photographs. "You're awfully quiet tonight, Jake," his mother observed, a note of concern in her voice. "Are you feeling all right?" Jake startled, realizing he'd been lost in thought again. "Oh, yeah, I'm fine," he mumbled, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about stuff." Tom's kind eyes met Jake's across the table. "Penny for your thoughts, son?" he asked, his voice gentle and encouraging. For a moment, Jake was tempted to blurt out everything: the discovery in the attic, the medals, the photographs. But something held him back. The dinner table, with his parents present and the conversation flowing, didn't feel like the right time or place for such a revelation. "It's nothing, Grandpa," Jake replied, trying to sound casual. "Just wondering about some things." Tom nodded, a knowing look in his eyes that made Jake wonder if his grandfather somehow sensed what was on his mind. "Well," Tom said with a warm smile, "whenever you're ready to talk about those things, you know where to find me." As dinner progressed, Jake found himself studying his grandfather more intently than ever before. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before: the slight stiffness in Tom's movements as he reached for the salt, the way his left hand occasionally trembled ever so slightly. Were these the lingering effects of his time in the war, or simply the natural signs of aging that Jake had never bothered to notice before? After dinner, as the family moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Jake hung back. He watched as his grandfather eased himself into his favorite armchair, wincing almost imperceptibly as he sat. Jake's grandmother noticed immediately, moving to adjust a cushion behind Tom's back with practiced ease. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the unspoken understanding between them. As the evening wore on, Jake found himself growing increasingly restless. The weight of his discovery pressed on him, making it difficult to engage in the light-hearted family conversation. He excused himself early, claiming fatigue from the day's activities. Back in his room, Jake sat on the edge of his bed, the wooden chest once again in his lap. He opened it, lifting out the Medal of Honor and holding it up to the soft lamplight. The questions that had been swirling in his mind all evening crystallized into a single, burning desire to know the truth. Jake made a decision. Tomorrow, he would find a way to talk to his grandfather alone. He would show him the chest and ask about the medals, the photographs, and the history that had been hidden away for so long. As he carefully packed everything away and slid the chest back under his bed, Jake felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. Tomorrow, he thought as he drifted off to sleep, tomorrow he would uncover the story of the hero his grandfather used to be. And perhaps, in doing so, he would come to understand the hero his grandfather still was. The next day dawned with a golden haze, the sun peeking over the horizon and casting long shadows across the dewy grass. Jake had barely slept, his mind too full of questions and imagined scenarios. He'd rehearsed a dozen different ways to approach his grandfather, each one feeling more awkward than the last. As Jake made his way downstairs, the house was quiet save for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen, and Jake could hear the soft murmur of his grandparents' voices. He paused at the foot of the stairs, gathering his courage. Entering the kitchen, Jake found his grandmother bustling about, preparing breakfast. His grandfather sat at the small kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, the morning paper spread out before him. They both looked up as Jake entered, warm smiles greeting him. "Good morning, sweetheart," his grandmother said, moving to pour him a glass of orange juice. "Did you sleep well?" Jake nodded, not trusting his voice just yet. He slid into the chair opposite his grandfather, his heart pounding. Tom lowered his newspaper, his kind eyes meeting Jake's. "You're up early, son," Tom observed, a hint of curiosity in his voice. "Everything all right?" Jake took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Grandpa," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "can I talk to you about something? In private?" A flicker of concern passed over Tom's face, but he nodded, folding his newspaper and setting it aside. "Of course, Jake. Why don't we take a walk in the garden? The morning air will do us good." Relief washed over Jake. The garden was perfect, quiet, private, and away from the house. He nodded eagerly, following his grandfather out the back door after assuring his grandmother they'd be back for breakfast soon. The garden was a riot of colors in the early morning light. Dew clung to the petals of vibrant flowers, and the air was filled with the gentle buzzing of bees starting their day's work. Tom led the way down the winding path, his pace slow and measured. Jake walked beside him, the wooden chest clutched tightly in his hands. They reached a small bench nestled beneath an old oak tree, its branches providing a canopy of dappled shade. Tom eased himself onto the bench with a soft grunt, patting the space beside him. Jake sat down, the chest heavy in his lap. "Now then," Tom said gently. "What's on your mind, Jake?" Jake's fingers trembled as he unlatched the chest. "I found something yesterday, Grandpa," he said, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "In the attic." He opened the chest, revealing its contents. Tom's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the sudden stillness of the garden. Jake looked up to see his grandfather's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the gleaming Medal of Honor, nestled among the other awards and photographs. "I see," Tom said after a long moment, his voice heavy with emotion. "I wondered if this day would come." Jake's words tumbled out in a rush. "Why didn't you ever tell us, Grandpa, about being a war hero, about winning the Medal of Honor? I had no idea you'd done all these amazing things." Tom's weathered hand reached out, gently lifting the Medal of Honor from the chest. He held it up to the morning light, his eyes distant, as if looking at something far beyond the quiet garden. "Hero," he murmured, the word sounding almost like a question. "That's a complicated word, Jake." Tom fell silent for a moment, his thumb tracing the contours of the metal. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, tinged with a sadness Jake had never heard before. "I never told you about this part of my life because it's not something I'm proud of, Jake. Not in the way you might think." Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. "But Grandpa, it's the Medal of Honor. It's given for incredible bravery. How could you not be proud of that?" Tom's eyes met Jake's, and in them, Jake saw a depth of emotion he'd never witnessed before. A mixture of pain, regret, and a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere physical tiredness. Bravery, heroism. These are words people use when they don't understand the reality of war. "Jake," Tom said quietly, "what you see here?" He gestured to the chest. "These medals, these commendations, they don't tell the whole story. They don't show the fear, the loss, the things a person has to do to survive." Jake listened, transfixed, as his grandfather began to speak of things he'd never shared before. Tom told him of the day that had earned him the Medal of Honor, a day of chaos, gunfire, and desperate choices. He spoke of leading his men through an ambush, of carrying wounded comrades to safety under a hail of bullets, of making split-second decisions that meant life or death. But as Tom spoke, Jake began to understand that this wasn't a tale of glory and triumph. His grandfather's voice shook as he recalled the friends he'd lost that day, the lives that had been forever changed. He spoke of the guilt of survival, of wondering why he had lived when others hadn't. "The medal says I saved lives that day," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But all I can remember are the ones I couldn't save, the faces of the men who didn't make it home. That's what this medal means to me, Jake. It's not a symbol of heroism. It's a reminder of the cost of war." Jake sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything he'd heard. The grandfather he thought he knew so well suddenly seemed like a stranger, a man who had lived through experiences Jake could scarcely imagine. "But Grandpa," Jake said hesitantly, "even if it brings back painful memories, isn't it important to remember? To honor what you and your friends went through?" Tom smiled sadly, placing a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "There are many ways to honor the past, Jake. For me, the best way to honor my friends, to make sense of everything that happened, was to live a life of peace, to tend my garden, to love my family, to find joy in simple things. That's why I put these medals away. Not to forget, but to focus on building a life worthy of the sacrifices made." As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Jake and his grandfather sat together on that garden bench, surrounded by the beauty of blooming flowers and the gentle hum of nature. Tom began to share more stories, not just of the war, but of the struggle to find peace afterward, of building a life with Jake's grandmother, of the everyday heroism of choosing kindness and compassion in a world that had shown him so much cruelty. Jake listened, his initial excitement about discovering a war hero grandfather transforming into a deep respect for the quiet strength it had taken Tom to build a life of peace. He began to understand that true heroism wasn't always about grand gestures or medals. Sometimes, it was about facing each day with courage, about choosing love over bitterness, about finding beauty in a world that had shown you its darkest side. As they finally made their way back to the house, the smell of breakfast wafting through the open windows, Jake felt as though he was seeing his grandfather and the world through new eyes. The wooden chest, still in his arms, no longer felt like a secret treasure. Instead, it was a bridge between past and present, a testament to the complex tapestry of human experience. Tom paused at the back door, turning to Jake with a gentle smile. "Thank you for listening, son," he said softly. "For wanting to understand. Just remember, the most important battles we fight are often the quiet ones, right here." He tapped his chest, right over his heart. Jake nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He realized that in seeking to uncover a hero from the past, he had discovered the everyday hero who had been in front of him all along. As they stepped back into the warmth of the kitchen, Jake knew that this morning's conversation was just the beginning of a deeper understanding, not just of his grandfather, but of the intricate, often painful journey that shaped the man he had become. The days that followed Jake's discovery in the attic were filled with a new kind of quiet. The initial shock of revelation had given way to a gentle, persistent curiosity that hung in the air between Jake and his grandfather. It was as if a door had been opened, one that had been locked for decades, and neither was quite sure how to step through it. Jake found himself watching his grandfather more closely than ever before. He noticed the way Tom's hands, calloused from years of gardening, would sometimes tremble slightly when he was lost in thought. He saw how his grandfather's eyes would occasionally drift to the horizon, focusing on something far beyond the peaceful countryside that surrounded them. It was on a warm afternoon, as they sat on the porch swing gently rocking back and forth, that Tom finally broke the silence. "You've been very patient, Jake," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the creaking of the swing's chains. "I can see you have more questions. It's okay to ask them." Jake's heart raced. He had indeed been bursting with questions, but had held back, unsure of how to broach the subject again. Now, with his grandfather's gentle encouragement, the words tumbled out. "What was it like, Grandpa? The war. I mean, how did you end up there? What happened on the day you earned the Medal of Honor?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, as if carefully choosing each word. "I was young, Jake, younger than I had any right to be, facing the things I faced. We all were, boys playing at being men, thrust into a world we could barely comprehend." As Tom began to speak, the gentle countryside around them seemed to fade away. In its place, Jake could almost see the world his grandfather described, a world of chaos, fear, and unexpected moments of profound humanity. Tom told him about enlisting, driven by a mixture of patriotism and youthful bravado. He spoke of the grueling training, of friendships forged in the crucible of shared hardship. His voice grew softer as he recalled the journey overseas, the pit of fear in his stomach as their ship crossed the vast, dangerous expanse of the Atlantic. "We were so young, so unprepared," Tom mused, shaking his head. "And no amount of training could have truly readied us for what we faced." Jake listened, transfixed, as his grandfather painted a vivid picture of life on the front lines. Tom spoke of the constant tension, the bone-deep weariness that came from never feeling truly safe. He described the camaraderie that developed between soldiers, the dark humor they used to cope with the horrors around them. "But it wasn't all darkness," Tom said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Even in the midst of war, there were moments of beauty, of kindness. I remember a French family who sheltered us for a night, sharing what little food they had. I remember the way the sunrise looked over the fields of Normandy, so peaceful you could almost forget the war for a moment." As the afternoon wore on, Tom's story reached the day that had earned him the Medal of Honor. His voice grew quieter, more intense, and Jake found himself leaning in, hanging on every word. "It was meant to be a routine patrol," Tom began, his eyes distant with memory. "We'd been pushing the enemy back for weeks, and morale was high. We thought we had them on the run." What followed was a tale that left Jake breathless. Tom described how their unit had been ambushed, caught in a deadly crossfire that seemed to come from all directions at once. In vivid detail, he recounted the chaos of the battle, the deafening explosions, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the cries of the wounded. "I don't remember deciding to do what I did," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was like my body was moving on its own. I saw my friends falling, and something in me just snapped." Jake listened in awe as his grandfather described how he had led a desperate counterattack, rallying the surviving members of his unit. Tom told of how he had moved through the battlefield, seemingly impervious to the danger around him, pulling wounded comrades to safety and organizing a defense that eventually turned the tide of the battle. They say I saved a dozen lives that day, Tom said, his voice heavy with emotion. But all I can remember are the ones I couldn't save. The faces of the men who didn't make it home. As Tom spoke, Jake began to understand the weight his grandfather had carried all these years. The Medal of Honor, which Jake had seen as a symbol of glory and heroism, took on a new meaning. In Tom's hands, it was a reminder of loss, of sacrifices made, of a day when the world had asked more of him than any human should have to give. The citation says, "I showed ye conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty," Tom said, quoting words that had clearly been seared into his memory. But in the moment, Jake, it wasn't about gallantry or duty, it was about survival. It was about not letting down the men who depended on me. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Tom's story drew to a close. Jake sat in silence, trying to process everything he had heard. The grandfather he thought he knew had been transformed in his eyes, not diminished, but expanded. The quiet, gentle man who tended his garden with such care was also the brave soldier who had faced unimaginable horrors. "I've never told anyone all of this before," Tom said softly, reaching out to place a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Not even your grandmother knows all the details. It's not an easy thing to talk about." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the trust his grandfather had placed in him. "Thank you for telling me, Grandpa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." Tom smiled, a sad but gentle expression. "You don't have to say anything, Jake. Just remember that war isn't like the movies or the video games. It's messy, it's painful, and it leaves scars that never fully heal. But also remember that even in the darkest moments, there's room for courage, for compassion, for hope." As they sat together on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, Jake felt as though he was seeing his grandfather and the world through new eyes. The story he had heard was one of bravery, yes, but also of pain, of loss, of the complex reality of human experience in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Jake realized that the true heroism of his grandfather lay not just in his actions on that fateful day decades ago, but in the life he had built afterward, in the kindness he showed to everyone he met, in the peace he had found tending his garden, in the love he gave so freely to his family. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Jake made a silent promise to himself. He would honor his grandfather not by glorifying the war that had shaped him, but by living up to the example of quiet strength, compassion, and resilience that Tom set every day. The Medal of Honor, hidden away for so many years, had opened a door to the past, but it was the man sitting beside him, gazing up at the stars with a mixture of sadness and wonder, who truly embodied the meaning of heroism. In that moment, Jake understood that some of the greatest battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the quiet moments of everyday life, and that his grandfather had been winning those battles all along. The days that followed Tom's revelation were filled with a new kind of understanding between grandfather and grandson. Jake found himself seeing his grandfather in a different light, noticing small details he had overlooked before. The way Tom's eyes would sometimes cloud over with memory, the slight stiffness in his movements that spoke of old injuries, the nightmares that occasionally disturbed his sleep, all these took on new significance in light of what Jake now knew. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Jake gathered the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at him. "Grandpa," he began hesitantly, "what was it like? After the war? Coming home, I mean." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, tinged with a sadness that made Jake's heart ache. "Coming home," Tom mused, shaking his head slightly. "You know, Jake, in some ways, that was harder than the war itself." As Tom began to speak, Jake found himself transported once again, this time to a world he had never considered, the world of a young soldier trying to find his place in a peacetime that no longer felt like home. Tom described the surreal feeling of returning to a country that had moved on while he had been fighting for his life. The parades and celebrations felt hollow, the cheering crowds unable to understand the weight of what he and his fellow soldiers had experienced. "We came back different men," Tom explained, his voice heavy with memory. "The things we'd seen, the things we'd done, they changed us in ways that were hard to explain to those who hadn't been there." Jake listened intently as his grandfather spoke of the challenges he faced in those early days, the nightmares that plagued his sleep, filled with the sounds of gunfire and the faces of fallen comrades. The way loud noises would send his heart racing, his body instinctively bracing for an attack that never came, the guilt that gnawed at him, the constant question of why he had survived when so many others hadn't. They called it battle fatigue back then, Tom said, a wry smile touching his lips. "These days, they have fancier names for it. PTSD, they call it now. But whatever name you give it, it all comes down to the same thing. War leaves scars, Jake. Not just on the body, but on the mind and soul as well." Tom spoke of the difficulty in adjusting to civilian life. Jobs that once seemed important now felt trivial in comparison to the life-and-death decisions he had faced in combat. Relationships were strained as he struggled to connect with people who couldn't understand what he had been through. "Your grandmother?" Tom said, his voice softening with affection. "She was my anchor in those stormy days. She didn't always understand what I was going through, but she never stopped trying. Her patience, her unwavering love, that's what saved me, Jake." As the night deepened around them, Tom shared stories he had never told anyone before. He spoke of the survivors, guilt that haunted him, the feeling that he hadn't done enough, hadn't saved enough lives. The Medal of Honor, meant to be a symbol of valor, often felt like a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the cost of that fateful day. "I'd wake up in cold sweats," Tom confessed, his voice barely above a whisper, reliving those moments, seeing the faces of the men we lost. "Your grandmother would hold me, tell me I was safe, that it was over. But in my mind, it was never really over." Jake listened, his heart heavy with the weight of his grandfather's words. He began to understand that the quiet strength he had always admired in Tom wasn't just a natural trait, but something hard-won, forged in the crucible of war and its aftermath. Tom spoke of the long journey towards healing, a path that was never straight or easy. He told Jake about the support groups he eventually joined, where he found solace in the company of other veterans who understood his struggles. He spoke of the therapists who helped him develop coping mechanisms, teaching him how to manage the flashbacks and anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. "It was your father's birth that really turned things around for me," Tom said, a smile warming his features. "Holding that tiny life in my arms, I realized I had a choice to make. I could let the war define me, let it consume me, or I could choose to live, really live, for the sake of this new life that depended on me." As Tom continued, Jake began to see his grandfather's passion for gardening in a new light. The hours spent nurturing plants, coaxing life from the soil, it wasn't just a hobby, but a form of therapy, a way of finding peace and purpose in the wake of so much destruction. "Every seed I planted, every flower that bloomed," Tom explained, gesturing towards his beloved garden. "It was a small act of creation, a way of balancing out the destruction I'd been part of. In the garden, I found a way to make things grow instead of destroy them." The moon had risen high in the sky by the time Tom's story drew to a close. Jake sat in silence, trying to process everything he had heard. The grandfather he had always known, patient, kind, with a quiet strength that seemed unshakable, now stood revealed as a man who had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. "I'm telling you all this, Jake," Tom said, reaching out to place a hand on his grandson's shoulder, "not to burden you, but to help you understand. The man I am today, the grandfather you know, he exists because of everything that came before. The good and the bad, the triumphs and the struggles, they all shaped me." Jake nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I'm glad you told me, Grandpa," he managed to say. I had no idea you'd been through so much." Tom smiled, a gentle expression that held both sadness and hope. "That's the thing about invisible scars, Jake. They're easy to hide, but they're always there. The trick is learning to live with them, to find meaning and purpose despite them, or even because of them." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, fireflies still dancing in the distance, Jake felt a profound sense of connection to his grandfather. The story he had heard was one of struggle and resilience, of a man who had faced the darkest aspects of human experience and still found a way to choose love, to choose life. Jake realized that the true heroism of his grandfather lay not just in his actions during the war, but in every day that followed. In the courage it took to face each new day, to build a life of peace and kindness in the wake of such trauma. The Medal of Honor, hidden away for so many years, paled in comparison to the quiet, everyday heroism Tom had displayed throughout his life. As they finally stood to head inside, Tom paused, looking out over his garden one last time. "Remember, Jake," he said softly, "our experiences shape us, but they don't define us. It's what we choose to do with those experiences that matters. Every day is a chance to choose kindness, to choose hope, to make the world a little bit better than we found it." Jake nodded, feeling a new sense of purpose stirring within him. He vowed silently to honor his grandfather, not just by remembering his wartime bravery, but by living up to the example of resilience, compassion, and quiet strength that Tom set every day. As they walked back to the house, the weight of history and memory hanging between them, Jake understood that he had been given a precious gift. Not just the knowledge of his grandfather's past, but a deeper understanding of the complex, often painful journey that shapes a human life. And with that understanding came a renewed appreciation for the power of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the profound impact one life, lived with courage and compassion, can have on the world. In the days that followed their heart-to-heart conversations, Jake found himself seeing his grandfather in an entirely new light. The quiet, unassuming man he had known all his life had been transformed in his eyes, not diminished by the revelations of his past, but magnified, his everyday actions taking on new significance and depth. Jake began to notice things he had overlooked before. The way Tom always had a kind word for everyone he met, from the cashier at the local grocery store to the new family that had moved in down the road. The patience he showed when teaching Jake how to properly prune the rose bushes or harvest the ripe tomatoes from the garden. The gentle humor that often softened his grandfather's words, bringing light to even the most serious conversations. One sunny afternoon, as they worked side by side in the garden, Jake found himself studying his grandfather's hands. They were weathered and calloused, marked by years of hard work and the ravages of time, but they moved with a surprising gentleness as they tended to the delicate seedlings, coaxing life from the rich soil. "You know, Grandpa," Jake said, pausing in his work, "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've told me." Tom looked up, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Oh," he said, a hint of curiosity in his voice. "And what conclusions have you come to, young man?" Jake was quiet for a moment, carefully considering his words. I think you're still a hero, Grandpa. Maybe even more of a hero than I thought before." Tom's eyebrows rose in surprise. "How do you figure that?" he asked, his tone gentle but genuinely curious. Jake set down his trowel, turning to face his grandfather fully. "It's not just about what you did in the war," he explained, his words coming faster as he tried to articulate the thoughts that had been swirling in his mind. "It's about everything you've done since then. The life you've built, the kindness you show to everyone, the way you've dealt with everything you went through. That's real heroism, isn't it?" Tom was silent for a long moment, his eyes misting slightly as he regarded his grandson. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "That's a very wise observation, Jake, and a very kind one." As the days passed, Jake found himself eagerly absorbing every story, every piece of wisdom his grandfather shared. He listened with rapt attention as Tom spoke of the friends he had made during the war, men from all walks of life united by a common purpose. He heard tales of bravery and sacrifice, but also of moments of unexpected beauty and humanity amid the chaos of conflict. But it wasn't just the war stories that captivated Jake. He was equally fascinated by his grandfather's accounts of the years that followed, the struggles to readjust to civilian life, the small triumphs of recovery, the journey of building a family and a home filled with love. Jake began to see how the experiences of war had shaped his grandfather's approach to life. The value Tom placed on peace and understanding, his ability to find joy in simple pleasures, his unwavering commitment to his family and community. All of these, Jake realized, were rooted in the profound lessons learned during those harrowing years of his youth. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jake turned to his grandfather with a question that had been nagging at him. "Grandpa," he began hesitantly, "do you ever regret it? Joining the army? I mean, going through everything you did?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "Regret is a tricky thing, Jake," he said slowly. "There are moments I wish I could change, decisions I wish I could unmake, the friends I lost, the horrors I saw. There are days when the weight of those memories feels almost unbearable." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "But regret? No, I don't think I regret it, because everything I experienced, good and bad, made me who I am. It taught me the value of life, the importance of kindness, the strength that can be found in compassion. And it led me here, to this life, to your grandmother, to you and your father. How could I regret that?" Jake nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He understood then that his grandfather's heroism wasn't confined to a single act of bravery on a battlefield long ago. It was a lifelong commitment to choosing love over hate, hope over despair, growth over stagnation. As the summer days stretched on, Jake found himself spending more and more time with his grandfather. They worked together in the garden, Tom patiently teaching Jake the secrets of coaxing life from the soil. They went fishing in the nearby creek, sharing comfortable silences broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. They sat on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything from history and philosophy to the simple joys of a well-tended garden. Through it all, Jake's admiration for his grandfather grew. He saw how Tom's experiences had given him a unique perspective on life, a depth of understanding that went beyond mere knowledge. He marveled at his grandfather's ability to find beauty in the simplest things. A perfect tomato ripened on the vine, the song of a mockingbird at dawn, the laughter of family gathered around the dinner table. One day, as they were cleaning out an old shed at the back of the property, Jake came across a dusty box filled with old photographs and letters. With Tom's permission, he began to sift through them, each yellowed envelope and faded image offering a glimpse into his grandfather's past. There were photos of Tom as a young soldier, standing tall and proud in his uniform, letters from comrades, filled with inside jokes and heartfelt expressions of friendship, newspaper clippings detailing acts of bravery, including the one that had earned Tom his Medal of Honor. But what struck Jake most were the letters from his grandmother. Written in a delicate, flowing script, they were filled with love, encouragement, and unwavering support. Through these letters, Jake began to understand the crucial role his grandmother had played in Tom's journey of healing and growth. "Your grandmother," Tom said softly, noticing Jake's interest in the letters. "She was my anchor when I felt adrift, my light when the world seemed dark. Her love gave me the strength to face each day, to keep moving forward when all I wanted to do was give up." Jake looked up at his grandfather, seeing the love and gratitude shining in his eyes. In that moment, he understood that true heroism often comes not in grand gestures or moments of epic bravery, but in the quiet, persistent choice to love, to heal, to grow. As the summer drew to a close and the time approached for Jake to return home, he found himself filled with a mix of emotions. There was sadness at the thought of leaving, of course, but also a profound sense of gratitude for the time he had spent with his grandfather, for the stories shared and the lessons learned. On his last evening at the farm, Jake and Tom sat on the porch swing, gently rocking back and forth as they watched the fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. Jake turned to his grandfather, his heart full of the admiration and love that had grown over the summer. "Thank you, Grandpa," he said softly, "for everything, for sharing your stories, for teaching me so much. I hope I can be half the man you are someday." Tom smiled, reaching out to squeeze Jake's shoulder gently. "You're already well on your way, Jake," he said, his voice warm with pride and affection. "Just remember, true strength isn't about conquering others or proving your worth through grand gestures. It's about facing each day with courage and kindness, about choosing love even when it's difficult. That's the legacy I hope to leave you." As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Jake made a silent vow to himself. He would carry his grandfather's lessons with him always, honoring Tom's legacy, not just by remembering his past heroism, but by embodying the values of compassion, resilience, and quiet strength that his grandfather lived every day. The Medal of Honor, once hidden away in a dusty attic, had opened a door to the past, but it was the man sitting beside him, gazing up at the stars with wonder and wisdom in his eyes, who truly embodied the meaning of heroism. In that moment, Jake understood that some of the greatest battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the quiet moments of everyday life, and that his grandfather had been winning those battles all along. The morning of Jake's departure dawned clear and crisp, with a hint of autumn in the air. As he packed his belongings, carefully wrapping the photographs and mementos his grandfather had given him, Jake felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. The summer had been transformative, filled with discoveries and revelations that had changed his perspective on life, family, and the true nature of heroism. As he zipped up his suitcase, there was a soft knock at the door. Tom entered, holding something behind his back, a gentle smile on his weathered face. "I have something for you, Jake," he said, his voice warm with affection. "Something I want you to have." Jake watched curiously as his grandfather revealed what he had been hiding, the wooden chest that had started this entire journey of discovery. Jake's eyes widened in surprise. "But Grandpa," he began, "I can't take that. It's your—" Tom held up a hand, silencing Jake's protests. "It's time for this to be passed on," he said softly. "These memories, these stories, they're part of your heritage now. I want you to have them, to keep them safe, and to remember." With trembling hands, Jake accepted the chest. It felt heavier now, weighted not just with medals and photographs, but with the responsibility of a legacy. As he opened it, he gasped. Nestled among the familiar contents was something new, one of Tom's medals, not the Medal of Honor, but one that Jake recognized from their many conversations over the summer. "That's my Bronze Star," Tom explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I earned it for actions in a battle before the day that got me the Medal of Honor. I want you to have it, Jake, to remember not just the big moments of heroism, but the everyday courage that gets us through life's battles." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes as he carefully lifted the medal, feeling its weight in his palm. I don't know what to say, Grandpa. Thank you. I'll treasure it always." Tom smiled, reaching out to squeeze Jake's shoulder. "Just remember, son, the true value of that medal isn't in the metal it's made of, or even in the act it represents. Its value is in the lessons it teaches, about courage, about duty, about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." As they made their way downstairs, Jake's parents were waiting by the car, ready for the long drive home. There were hugs all around, promises to visit soon, and more than a few tears shed. But as Jake hugged his grandfather one last time, he felt something had fundamentally shifted between them. "Remember what we talked about," Tom said softly, his voice for Jake's ears alone. "True heroism isn't about medals or glory. It's about how you live your life every day, how you treat others, how you face the challenges that come your way." Jake nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. As he climbed into the car, the wooden chest secure in his lap, he watched his grandparents standing on the porch, waving goodbye. Tom stood tall and straight, looking every inch the hero Jake now knew him to be. The drive home was long, giving Jake plenty of time to reflect on the summer's events. He thought about the stories he'd heard, the lessons he'd learned, and the new understanding he had of his family's history. But more than that, he thought about the man his grandfather was, not just the young soldier who had earned a nation's highest honor, but the kind, wise, and gentle man who had shaped Jake's life in countless ways. As the familiar sights of home came into view, Jake made a decision. He would honor his grandfather's legacy not by boasting about the medals or the acts of wartime heroism, but by living up to the example Tom set every day. He would strive to be kind, to be brave in the face of life's challenges, to find beauty in the simple things, and to always stand up for what was right. The weeks that followed were busy with the start of a new school year, but Jake found himself changed by his summer experiences. He approached his studies with new diligence, understanding now the value of the opportunities he had been given. He went out of his way to be kind to others, remembering his grandfather's words about the importance of compassion. One day, as Jake was working on a history project, his teacher noticed the intense focus with which he approached the subject of World War II. "You seem to have a special interest in this period, Jake," she observed. "Any particular reason?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "My grandfather," he said simply. He served in the war. This summer, I learned about his experiences, about the kind of man he is. It made me realize how much there is to learn from history and from the people who lived through it." His teacher nodded approvingly. "That's wonderful, Jake. Personal connections like that can really bring history to life. Would you be interested in sharing some of what you learned with the class?" Jake thought about it for a moment. He remembered the wooden chest, now sitting on a shelf in his room, filled with memories and mementos of his grandfather's service. He thought about the stories Tom had shared, not just of wartime bravery, but of the struggle to find peace in the years that followed. "I'd like that," Jake said finally. "But not just about the war itself. I'd like to talk about what comes after, about how people rebuild their lives, about the kind of courage it takes to choose peace and kindness after experiencing so much violence." His teacher's eyes widened slightly, impressed by the maturity of Jake's perspective. "That sounds like an excellent presentation, Jake. I look forward to hearing it." As Jake began to prepare his presentation, he found himself returning again and again to the wooden chest. He carefully sifted through its contents, each item bringing back memories of the conversations he'd had with his grandfather over the summer. He decided to bring a few items to share with his class: a photograph of his grandfather in uniform, a letter Tom had written home during the war, and, after getting permission from his parents, the bronze star his grandfather had given him. The day of the presentation arrived, and Jake stood before his class, nervous but determined. He began not with tales of battles won or enemies defeated, but with a description of his grandfather as he knew him. A kind, gentle man with a passion for gardening and a deep love for his family. From there, Jake wove a story that captivated his classmates and teacher alike. He spoke of the young man who had gone off to war, of the horrors he had witnessed and the bravery he had shown. But more than that, he spoke of the man who had returned, who had struggled to find his place in a world that no longer made sense to him. Jake described his grandfather's journey, the nightmares, the guilt, the difficulty in adjusting to civilian life. But he also spoke of the strength Tom had shown in facing these challenges, of the love that had sustained him, and of the life he had built in the years since the war. As he concluded his presentation, Jake held up the bronze star, its metal gleaming in the classroom lights. "My grandfather gave me this medal," he said, his voice strong and clear. "But the real gift he gave me was the example he sets every day. He taught me that true heroism isn't just about what you do in moments of great danger or high stakes. It's about how you live your life every day, how you treat others, how you face the challenges that come your way." Jake looked around at his classmates, seeing the impact his words had made. "My grandfather's generation is often called The greatest generation, he said, and they did incredible things. But I think the greatest thing they did wasn't winning the war. It was how they lived their lives afterward. How they chose to build a better world. How they chose peace and love over bitterness and hate. As Jake returned to his seat amidst applause from his classmates and a beaming smile from his teacher, he felt a sense of pride and purpose. He had honored his grandfather's legacy, not by glorifying war, but by sharing the deeper, more personal story of one man's journey from the battlefields of Europe to the quiet heroism of everyday life. That evening, Jake called his grandfather to tell him about the presentation. As he described how he had shared Tom's story with his class, he could hear the emotion in his grandfather's voice. "I'm proud of you, Jake," Tom said softly. "You understood the real story, the part that truly matters. You're carrying forward the best parts of our family's legacy." As Jake hung up the phone, he glanced at the wooden chest on his shelf. It no longer seemed like a relic of a distant past, but a bridge between generations, a reminder of the threads of love, courage, and resilience that tied him to his grandfather and to all those who had come before. He realized then that the greatest gift his grandfather had given him wasn't the medal or even the stories of wartime bravery. It was the example of a life well lived, of a man who had faced the darkest aspects of human nature and still chosen to live with kindness, compassion, and hope. As Jake drifted off to sleep that night, he made a silent promise to himself and to his grandfather. He would live his life in a way that honored that legacy, facing each day with courage and kindness, always striving to make the world a little bit better than he found it. In the quiet of his room, with the moonlight casting a soft glow on the wooden chest, Jake felt a profound connection to his grandfather and to the generations that had come before. He understood now that he was part of something larger than himself, a continuum of human experience that stretched back through time. And in that moment, Jake knew that the true heroism his grandfather had passed down to him wasn't captured in medals or citations. It was in the daily choice to live with integrity, to face life's challenges with courage, and to always choose love.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.